Welcome, everybody. This is, of course, our virtual Munch and Learn. I'm really glad you're here. And if you're not muted, please take the time to mute yourself now. And we are recording this presentation and it will be added to our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to the Dixon YouTube channel. And you can also find videos on art and horticulture and art and horticulture activities at dixon.org on the Dixon at Home page of our website. And during the talk, when a question pops into your head, before you forget it, go ahead and click chat, click on the chat button at the bottom of the screen and type in your question, and there will be time for questions at the end of the talk. So Kevin loves a good short introduction. And so let me present to you Kevin Sharp, the Linda W. and S. Herbert Ray Director of the Dixon Gallery and Gardens.
You don't have that memorized yet, do you, Lindley?
I don't. I still have to write it down.
All right. So I'm going to share screen, right? And I should click on Eileen's thing, right? No, just kidding. And then from the beginning, right?
That is correct.
And there you have it. Everybody seeing the screen?
Yes.
All right. All right. So, okay. Well, thanks for being here, everyone. And you know, one of the things that this show has done really, I think, very, very well, as those of you who heard the first half of this talk is, I think this exhibition has America's Impressionism, Echoes of a Revolution, has really kind of stretched the way we think about the Impressionist aesthetic and its and the way it is, the way it comes about, and the way it thrives, and the way it endures, and where it thrives and endures in the United States. And so, if you haven't seen the show, by all means, make a reservation, or not. You're probably okay. We haven't had so many visitors that it's necessarily required, but it's helpful if you make a reservation and come see the show. It's a beautiful exhibition, and it's a special show as well. So here we go. I'm just going to give the briefest overview of what we covered in part one. Okay, so Impressionism. It all kind of starts with Claude Monet and the painting you're looking at right now, Impression Sunrise, which gives the movement its name, when it's shown in the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. A critic named Louis Leroy dubs them, tongue-in-cheek, the Impressionists. And boy, does that name stick. America's familiarity with French Impressionism happens very, very early, actually. So the first Impressionist show is in 1874. The man on your left, right here, I'm assuming you're seeing my cursor, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. The man on the left is the novelist Henry James, who actually reviews the 1876 exhibition. This man in the center, as painted by James Whistler, is a man named George Lucas. Now, he won't go on to make the Star Wars movies, but he is a very important figure in American art. He is an art advisor. He's an American art advisor based in Paris. And we know from his journals that he went to the 1877 Impressionist show. And the young man on the right is the American painter J. Alden Weir, who very famously goes to the 1877 Impressionist exhibition He is a student of the academic painter Jean-Léon Gérôme, and he calls what he sees at the 1877 Impressionist exhibition, which some people say was the best of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions. He writes to his parents and says it was like being in a chamber of horrors. Now, he will change that viewpoint dramatically, but so these are some of the first Americans to encounter Impressionism in Paris. And then, of course, the American painter Mary Cassatt is the only American to actually participate in Impressionist exhibitions. And she becomes part of the Impressionist circle along about 1877. And by the 1879 show, which is the 4th Impressionist exhibition, she is exhibiting her work, and her work is by and large views of young women at the opera. And so if you could time travel and go back to Paris in 1879 and go see the 4th Impressionist exhibition, you would have seen Degas' paintings of dancers on the stage, Jean-Louis Forin's mostly gouaches and watercolors of dancers in the wings, and you'd see Mary Cassatt painting young women, young debutantes seated in a loge. And so there was a kind of unity of purpose there that really worked well. So which also leads me to suggest that Americans are, not only participants in the Impressionist project very, very early, they are deeply part of it. To be so connected to 2 key figures in the Impressionist group as Mary Cassatt was, that's a pretty important indicator of how significant America's participation in this movement is. And then in 1886, the art dealer Paul Dewell hosts a major exhibition of Impressionist paintings in the United States, in New York. And later, maybe it was the following year, he opens a gallery in New York. And this is his gallery on 5th Avenue at 36th Street. It looks nothing like that now. And this is a storeroom in that gallery. And among the works we're looking at is Mary Cassatt's another loge painting from 1878, and this Monet of Pourville from 1882. And the rest are not so easily identifiable, but that looks like a Corot to me, but could be anything. So far we have the Impressionist experiment coming together in Paris in the mid-70s. Americans participating in it, either as viewers and critics, or as in the case of Mary Cassatt, as artists. We have Duran Dewell, the Parisian dealer, Paul Duran Dewell, trying to establish a toehold with American collectors in the United States. And then we have American artists like Willard Metcalf making his way to Paris and to study, and beyond Paris, also making Giverny and his destination. And this is a view of Giverny. We're actually looking at part of Monet's compound at Giverny. It's tempting to think that this little figure up here, these little figures up here, maybe one of them is Claude Monet. Could be, maybe not too. And of course, poppies are a quintessential Monet subject. And so moving into the 1890s, I'm showing you the Fine Arts Society building in New York. We're on West 57th Street in New York. And this building is significant because in 1892 or thereabouts, American Impressionists will make this facility the home base, and in the form of the Society of American Artists. Now, the Society of American Artists was a secessionist group in the United States that splinters off from the National Academy of Design in 1877. They are very conscious of the Impressionist schism with official art, and they essentially do the same thing. They are frustrated by the lack of exhibiting opportunities at the National Academy of Design. They start their own group, and by the early 1890s, that group is dedicated to nothing quite so much as the advancement of Impressionism. Okay, and if you wanted to see Impressionism in the United States in the early 1890s, you would go to 215 West 57th Street in New York. And then finally, in 1893, this is basically where we left off in part one. The World's Colombian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 is really the coming out party for Impressionism. We see Theodore Robinson, who's an important American Impressionist painter, painting a view of the Colombian Exposition, but so did Twachtman, so did Hassam, so did J. Alden Weir, so did any number of other artists. Mary Cassatt's mural, Modern Woman, was commissioned for the Women's Building at the Colombian Exposition. This is a key moment in the evolution of American Impressionism, and it's in some ways very much a launching pad. Now, I've told people this, in a couple of different ways, but I'll just say the World's Fairs, which were were a much bigger deal in Europe than they were in the United States until this particular fair. But the World's Fairs in Paris, in 67, in 78, in 89, couldn't have meant less to the French Impressionists. Couldn't have meant less. The Impressionists didn't even organize a show in 1878, even though there would be millions of people coming to Paris to visit the World's Fair. In 78. And the 1878 Paris Fair was the fair where they revealed that after the Franco-Prussian War 7 years earlier and the Commune, that everything was fine. We put the city back together. We're on track. We're a republic again. Things are good. And the Impressionists simply couldn't get it together to put an exhibition in place in 1878. So while it couldn't have mattered less to the French, as we'll see, American artists embraced World's Fairs in a pretty meaningful way, and starting with the Colombian Exposition. Okay, so that was basically part one. What happens next? What happens next, you ask? What an excellent question. What happens next is commerce. Commerce, yeah. And when we think of commerce, in the context of French Impressionism, well, there's almost nothing that we think of more, no one we think of more so than Paul Duran. And this is a photograph of him in his gallery. I'm not sure whether it's the New York gallery, or it could be because of the assumed date of the photograph, or the Parisian flagship. He also at various times opened galleries in London as well, and for a short time in Berlin. But you know how you can tell he's an art dealer. Besides that sort of I'm everybody's friend look in his eye, you can tell he's an art dealer because look what he's doing. Look at that elbow resting on a painting. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that museum people would never do, but art dealers would do, at the drop of a hat. So Paul Duran has his gallery in New York by this time. He is building a clientele, and but not everybody's buying there. Okay, and so William Howe Downs, a Boston writer for New England Magazine, writes in 1892, almost all the Impressionist paintings brought to the United States thus far have been imported by a certain dealer. Now, in Boston, they're so tasteful, they would never call them out by name. A certain dealer whose principal shops are in Paris and New York we'll specify a little bit more. The other picture dealers here have received them from him and have made such a market for them as was possible. Very soon, a considerable number of American artists began to manifest marked symptoms of sympathy for the Purple Mania. The Purple Mania, which is what he's calling Impressionism, and a tendency to noisy effects which the Impressionists produce in their mistaken attempts at brilliancy. Impressionism is a fad. Now, William Howe Downs was not an idiot. He was a very smart man, in fact, and an excellent writer and an excellent art writer, but I don't think he could have gotten this any more wrong. And you know, American collectors simply didn't care what William Howe Downs had to say. You know, the people that were in a position to buy significant art from Paul Duran Dewell trusted their own judgments far more than they trusted William Howe Downs, or if they didn't trust their own judgments, they certainly trusted Paul Duran Dewell to point them in the right direction. And someone who absolutely trusted Paul Duran Dewell was the woman you see right here, Bertha Palmer, who is the queen of the Colombian Exposition. Any of you who've been to Chicago and gone to the Palmer House, well, that was the hotel her husband, Potter Palmer, founded, along with an empire of real estate, and they were formidable art collectors. And this is the Palmer House, which sadly no longer exists. This is one room in the salon in the Palmer House. I think right over here, you see where I'm pointing? I believe that's a Monet painting. I'm almost certain that it is. As a matter of fact, I think it's poplar trees. It's surprising that painting is not in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago now, because all of the Palmer paintings eventually wound up there. Bertha Palmer buys something like 9 Impressionist paintings in 1892 alone. Not Impressionist paintings, Monet paintings in 1892 alone. And between then and the start of the 20th century, she and her husband will acquire 30 more. And then we have this woman, Louisine Havemeyer, and her daughter Electra, a pastel portrait made by Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt was Louisine Havemeyer's tremendous friend, a great friend, and ultimately her advisor in the collecting of Impressionist paintings. So Louisine Havemeyer, the sweet woman you see here with her delightful daughter, Louisine Havemeyer would buy 64 works by Degas, 16 paintings by Cassatt, she owned 12 Cézannes, 24 Manets, 29 Monets, 3 Renoirs, 5 Pissarros, and 2 Alfred Sisley's. When Louisine Havemeyer dies, I think it's sometime around 1930 or so, she leaves more than 3,000 works of art to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. 3,000 works of art. And we're not talking like her button collection. We're talking about works not unlike, I mean, they also collected old master paintings as well. And this sweet little girl right here will go on to found the Shelburne Museum in Shelburne, Vermont. And the Shelburne, if you've never been to the Shelburne Museum in Shelburne, Vermont, well, when the pandemic is over, you're going to want to get yourself up there because it is an amazing place. And they have a fair collection of Impressionist paintings too, that come from Electra. And you say, okay, well, that's all well and good, but what about the Americans? We know that Americans are buying French Impressionism. What's going on with the American painters? How are they faring? Well, it's a little confusing at first. I mean, here we have a beautiful painting by Child Haas on Country Church, New England. It's supposed to be in the show. It's not here yet. There's a chance that it could get here. We're working on it. But Haas, by anyone's definition, one of the most important American Impressionist painters, out there. By 1890, he's been to Paris. He's absorbed, what there was to learn. I mean, he's not really, to the best of my knowledge, he doesn't go to Giverny. He's not one of those painters, but he does find himself around Impressionism. And just 2 years after he paints this work, he says the word impression as applied to art has been abused, and in the general acceptance of the term has become perverted. So, here's Hassam, America's arguably definitive Impressionist painter, saying that impression in the context of Impressionism has become perverted. Now, I'm not really even sure what he means by that. I mean, I've quoted it a few times and I've thought about it at some length, but what I think is that there was concern among American painters, as Impressionism begins to take hold in the United States, in the 1890s especially. There's concern that they're going to appear derivative, that they're going to appear as if, all they're doing is monkey copying the French original, and that they won't be given credit for their own particular brand of invention. And Hassam was right. If that's what he meant, if that's what he was concerned about, he was right to be so concerned, because for the longest time, that perception really did survive in American academia, in art museums. Even right up to the time when I began working in art museums in 1988, we weren't really sure if there even was such a thing as American Impressionism. It just seemed it was something there was a bit of skepticism about. Now, there was a great deal of work done on the subject in the 1980s, and that really changed perceptions by any number of very good scholars. But it was a perception that at a certain point took hold and was hard to eradicate in a way. But the 1890s was this great moment for American Impressionism. Here's John Leslie Breck, Gray Day on the Charles from 1894. Breck is another one of the artists who spends a tremendous amount of time in Giverny, and really, he can't get close to Monet because Monet doesn't want American artists to be too close to him, or he's very selective in who he allows to be close to him. But when I look at this particular painting, a view of the Charles River that flows through Boston, I think of nothing quite so much as Monet's water lilies. There's water lilies kind of in the foreground here. And Breck was a very, very good student of what he was learning from Monet. And this painting is actually in the show. It's such a beautiful, and it's the cover of our book. See if I hold it up right there. There it is, cover of the book. You all should own this book. It's really good. And I'm not just saying it because, I wrote an essay in it. And then Theodore Robinson, this painting is in the exhibition as well. It's loaned to us by our partner in this exhibition, the Brandywine River Museum of Art. And this is a work from 1894. It's Cos Cob in Connecticut. Just a marvelous work. And Robinson is an essential figure in the emergence of Impressionism in the United States. It's flourishing in the United States. He is one of a couple of artists who actually does get close to Monet, who Monet trusts. Now, Robinson spends, I think something 6-8 years, something like that, in France, and most of it in Giverny. There's another beautiful painting of the Valley of the Seine near Vernon, which is kind of a bigger village upstream, downstream, upstream from Giverny. And Robinson, when he gets back from his Paris sojourn, he's an erudite guy as well as a wonderful painter. And he writes one of the first important essays on Monet in English. And so he's kind of You know, I mean, Americans had access to the paintings themselves. They could see the paintings themselves. But if they were subscribers to Century Magazine in 1892, they could actually read about Monet. And it's a very trenchant article. I mean, it really does have a first-hand account of a first-person account, really, of what it was like to know Claude Monet. Which brings us to 1895. So in 1895, you know, the Society of American Artists, remember that group that were in the Fine Arts Society building, you know, on West 57th Street. The Society of American Artists hold their annual exhibition, and the critic for the New York Times writes, Impressionism may have had something to do with it, but whatever the reason, the sales at the exhibition of the Society of American Artists have been so small as to smack of ridiculous. A little more liberality on the part of the jury, greater Catholicity in the selection of pictures, and a realization of the fact that the public will not have the Impressionists all in one great dose. The society has itself to blame if its exhibitions are unsuccessful. And to the New York Times critic, it's all because of Impressionism. It's all because of Impressionism. And so there begins to be this kind of backlash. I mean, after years of gaining ground, you know, the shows aren't selling like they used to, and critics are beginning to show greater hostility towards American Impressionism, and even some artists are pushing back on the aesthetic. And one of them is a painter named Kenyon Cox, who is academically trained and believes in academic painting. He's an easel painter. He's also a muralist. This is one of his paintings called Hope and Memory. It's from 1900, and it's now in the collection of Julia Collins Smith Museum of Fine Arts at Auburn University. Does this painting look familiar to anyone? Well, if it does, it's because at one time it belonged to the Dixon Gallery and Gardens. We used to own this painting. But we're so steeped in Impressionism. This was before my time, and certainly before the time of Julie Perotti. We were so steeped in Impressionism that we couldn't bear to own a really good work that was sort of anti-impressionist in nature. Now, sometimes seeing, you know, that anti-impressionism just makes you appreciate actual impressionism that much more, but our predecessors didn't feel that way, and they sold it at auction, and the Julia Collins Smith Museum of Fine Arts snapped it right up. So my real point here is that there were academic American painters who were absolutely opposed to Impressionism, and Kenyon Cox was also a member of the Society of American Artists, and he's he wants their shows to be commercially successful as well, and certainly the dealers do, and certainly many critics are just not sold on the idea of Impressionism, including this one, a man named Royal Cortisone. I misspelled his last name, but it doesn't matter. He was a longtime art critic for the New York Tribune and later the New York Herald Tribune, and and again, this is a very smart critic. I mean, he is one of the voices for art criticism in New York for more than 40 years. I mean, he writes books and those books are smart. I mean, he is somebody to be contended with, but he will never embrace Impressionism. You know, he will do all he can to disrupt it, and he feels the very same way about later modern art. But on the other hand, so while some artists are taking a more conservative approach to art and rejecting Impressionism, other painters like William Merritt Chase, and this painting, Seaside Flowers, from about 1897, is in the exhibition. It's loaned to us from Crystal Ridge's Museum of American Art in Bentonville. Other artists are embracing Impressionism more and more. Now, Chase goes through a variety of a number of evolutions over his career. I mean, he's a realist for a while. He's a Whistlerian aesthete for a while, but at a certain point, and he's primarily a portrait painter, and a teacher, which is how he makes his living. But at a certain point, I mean, Chase is so good, he does all of it well. And at a certain point, he embraces Impressionism, and he not only embraces it, he does it as well as anybody, certainly as well as any American. And so by 1896, 1897, the battle over Impressionism at the Society of American Artists has become so heated. Impressionists, some of the key Impressionist painters in the United States decide it's time for a change. It's time for a change. And the group of gentlemen you see here are some of America's most important impressionist painters. They are a group that become known as the 10 American Painters. They, en masse, resign from the Society of American Artists in 1897. This photograph is from about 10 years later, and the lineup changed slightly. But once again, we're looking at a schism, a group of artists peeling off from an established institution, in this case, the Society of American Artists. And you have Edward Simmons, William Merritt Chase, Willard Metcalf, you have Frank Benson, Edmund Tarbell, here's Child Hassam right here, Thomas Wilmer Dewing, J. Alden Weir, Joseph Rutherford Camp, and Robert Reed. And the 10 of them will band together as an independent exhibition society, and they will show together for the next 20 years. And so in many respects, this group of American Impressionists are, I would say, a much closer group than the French Impressionists ever were. And their group remains far more durable than the French Impressionists. Remember, the French Impressionists could only muster 8 shows over 12 years, with a variety of lineups and with constant hectoring of one another. This group gets along famously. They show their work together almost every year. Chase is a late addition. The original member of the 10 was John Henry Twachtman, but Twachtman dies in 1901 or 1902, and Chase is called upon. By then, he's so steeped in Impressionism.
I'm not getting any sound, Kevin.
Can everybody? Julie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Paul, I don't know what to tell you.
Paul, check your computer volume and see if it's up, or see if it accidentally got muted.
Yeah, it's strange that it happened. Sorry, Paul. Anyway, I'm assuming the rest of you can hear. Okay. So the 10 American painters become a significant exhibition.
Hey, Kevin, can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you fine. I'm not sure what to tell you, Paul. I don't think there's nothing I can do. I don't think. It's odd that you had it and then you didn't. No, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry about that. So the 10 American painters split off from the Society of American Artists. They host their first exhibition in 1898, and guess where it is? the Duran galleries. So once again, our friend Paul Duran has found his way into yet another market, yet another variation on Impressionism. But the 10 American painters will show their work at a variety of galleries in New York over the course of the next 20 years. And a big part of what they're selling, in a way, is independence, is separation from an established norm. And that independence becomes a kind of zeitgeist in the United States. It's the spirit of the times. I mean, it gets all the way to the White House in a sense. Theodore Roosevelt, this is John Singer Sargent's state portrait of our president in 1903. Teddy Roosevelt will become an important voice for progressivism in the United States, for trust busting of basically monopolized industries, and a crucial figure in as a really something of an emblem of personal independence. I mean, look at this pose. This is not necessarily a warm and fuzzy president. I mean, he's got his hand on this knob. He's got his hand on. It's almost like he's covering the globe. His hand on his hip. He's looking straight at us. It's a frontal pose. I mean, everything about it says I'm an independent figure here. And there was actually William Randolph Hearst, the great journalist, founds the Independent political party as a third party. And actually runs as a president against Roosevelt in 1904. So independence is very much in vogue and in the air in this moment. And it is such an important ingredient in the how do I say this? In the perseverance of Impressionism as a vanguard movement. Excuse me. Okay, it's now 1904. You probably gathered that by now. This man is Harrison S. Morris, as painted by Thomas Eakins in 1896. Now, Morris is the manager. Harrison Morris is the manager of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He organizes their exhibitions, but especially their large exhibition of American art that they hold every year. It's a juried show. And he organizes the 1904 exhibition as well. And that show is notable for lots of reasons. And one of them is because this beautiful painting by Mary Cassatt, that's now in the Smithsonian American Art Museum, The Caress from 1902, was in that show at the Pennsylvania Academy in 1904. And it wins a prize. It wins some kind of medal. And the jury awards it a medal. And Harrison Morris does his job as the manager of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia. And he writes to Mary Cassatt probably sometime in February of 1904 to tell her the good news that her painting has won a medal. Cassatt writes back sometime in March, we think. I was not aware that Messieurs Duran Dewell. So now at this point, Duran, it's Messieurs in the plural because Duran Dewell's two of his sons are running the New York branch of the gallery at this point. And Paul Duran Dewell is back in Paris. Cassatt writes, I was not aware that Messieurs Duran Dewell had sent a picture of mine to the exhibition. The picture being their property, they were at liberty to do as they pleased with it. I, however, who belong to the founders of the independent exhibition, must stick to my principles, our principles, which were no jury, no medals, no awards. I wrote now awards, but I meant no awards. Our first exhibition was held in 1879 and was a protest against official exhibitions. We have since been dubbed Impressionists, a name which might apply to Monet, but can have no meaning when attached to Degas' name. Now, what she really means there is a few things. And now there's nothing wrong with looking at the history of something you've been involved with through your own lenses, But when she says it could have no, Impressionism can't mean anything when attached to Degas' name, she's also saying it doesn't mean anything when it's attached to my name either. This is, at this point, Mary Cassatt is ready to cede the whole Impressionist idea to Monet, basically. Now, she also does another kind of interesting thing. She doesn't call it the Impressionist exhibitions as they were absolutely known. She calls it the Independent Exhibition, which is what it was called in 1879 when she joins the group. But she says specifically, our first exhibition. Now, we already know it wasn't their first exhibition. We know from the very beginning of this presentation that the first Impressionist show was in 1874. So Mary Cassatt is seeing things through the lens of her perception and her experience. But she has lighted on this really key word that will continue to be important for years to come, and that's independence, the independent exhibition. This willingness to step outside of officialdom just becomes more and more key to art experiences in the early part of the 20th century. Now, Harrison Morris was probably baffled by this letter, because Duran Dewell had been sending, without Mary Cassatt knowing it, her paintings to the Pennsylvania Academy juried show year after year since about, 1898, 1897, something like that. So, there apparently was no further reply from Morris, but it's like, he had to be thinking, what are you talking about, lady? We've been jurying your work for years. So, moving on. I love this photograph. This is a photograph from 1906. And it's totally staged. Nobody sits on a sofa with a hand in their pocket, but Everett Shinn did. This is Everett Shinn, Robert Henry, and John Sloan. Now, this is another group of artists who will ultimately become part of what's known as the Ashcan School. The Ashcan School. And they're not only rebelling against the National Academy of Design, the Society of American Arts, they're also not that crazy about Impressionism either. But the thing that they like, the thing that they really believe in, the thing that they can embrace from the Impressionist movement is independence. Independence. And so in 1908, they organized an exhibition of their work, the three of them and five others, and they called themselves the Eight, which is, obviously a riff on what? On what? It's a riff on the 10, and it's this kind of neutral terminology. It's not anybody's name. It's not a cute name like Impressionism, or even the Independence. It's the Eight. And John Sloan was so eager to not be part of the National Academy of Design. He said this: the National Academy of Design is no more a national agency than the National Biscuit Company, which was a cookie manufacturer at that time. So you know who you're dealing with here. Now, one of the artists who participates in the 1908 exhibition of the Eight at the Macbeth Gallery in New York is Maurice Prendergast. And this painting, the painting that you're looking at right now, is in our exhibition. This marvelous, marvelous Prendergast. It's on loan from the Munson Williams Proctor Arts Institute in Utica, New York, our great colleagues in Utica. And it has the added virtue of being presented in a Charles Prendergast frame. His brother Charles founded a company called Carrig Rohane with Herman Dudley Murphy, a painter and frame maker. And so what you're looking at when you come see this painting, when you come into the galleries and go to the Orgel Gallery and specifically, and you go into that space, and that this painting is hanging on the end wall by itself, you're looking at a little slice of perfection. Perfection. I mean, this is a brilliant Prendergast. It's from 1910, 1912, so it wasn't in that first exhibition of the 8, but it's very much in the Prendergast style. And you know, it's when you see a Prendergast, you always know you're looking at a Prendergast. You know, it's so incredibly distinctive. And one of the things that makes it so distinctive is that Prendergast does something that not very many Americans do. Not many Americans really embrace what the French called post-impressionism. You know, post-impressionism is, of course, the thing that comes after impressionism in a way. And it's artists, when we think of post-impressionists, we think of artists like Pierre Bonnard, Edward Vuillard, Maurice Denis. We think of Félix Vallotton. We think of lots and lots of painters that take impressionist innovations and turn it into something uniquely their own. But Americans, for whatever reason, don't really do that thing. And the only one I can think of who really does in that moment is Maurice Prendergast. And we have, you know, a masterpiece in our galleries right now. See, let me put it this way. When Americans talked about post-impressionism, they weren't really talking necessarily about a style. You know, when you see the words post-impressionism in the 1912, 1913, 1914 issues of the New York Times or the New York Tribune or anywhere else, when American critics are talking about post-impressionism, what they're really talking about is anything that comes after Impressionism. They are far more literal than descriptive. And this was something that I found incredibly interesting. So in 1912, another group of artists band together, the Association of American Painters and Sculptors. It's another splinter group. And this is a group the group is led by William Fitch Taylor, who we see here, but it also includes other such, modern painters as Walt Kuhn, and as a key organizer of this group, and Walter Pock, and then the attorney John Quinn will become very much a figure in this group, and they decide that they are going to create a group that will lead the New York art world, that will lead us into something else. Now, at this point, Fitch is still basically an impressionist painter, but he will give it up, and he will embrace abstraction and become a much more vanguard artist in a way. But if you look at the painting on his easel right here, it's kind of an impressionist picture. And here's what they do. Here's what the Association of Painters and Sculptors do that's really rather wise. When it's time to elect a president, they choose J. Alden Weir. By this point, Weir is you know what, in 1912, he is 35 years removed from having seen the third Impressionist exhibition. He's kind of a grand old man in New York, the New York art circles, but he's got credibility in the vanguard because, you know, he was one of the founders of the Society of American Artists that split off from the National Academy of Design. He was one of the members of the 10 that then split off from the Society of American Artists. And so by installing Weir, this group of young vanguard painters really did kind of, you know, give themselves instant credibility. But then they make the mistake of going after the National Academy of Design in the press. You know, just like John Sloan says, they're no more national than the National Biscuit Company. You know, Taylor in a statement says, you know, not that we're going to take the National Academy down, but that the National Academy is not relevant. And J. Alden Weir, who's elected president of this group, is not even at the meeting where he's elected president. He's not at the second meeting either. So he reads in the New York Times this goal of taking the National Academy down. And so he spends about a nanosecond planning his resignation from this group. And he writes to them, when you told me I was elected president of a new society formed for the exhibition of works by younger artists, I consented to serve in that capacity on the distinct understanding that no opposition to the National Academy of Design was intended. So here's the thing about Weir. You know, Weir was able to enter into two really, really interesting secession movements. And he did it so elegantly, no one ever got mad at him. But Weir was plenty mad when he learns that this organization that he's been elected president of planned to oppose the National Academy of Design. And so Weir resigns and he's replaced by Arthur B. Davies, this kind of mild-mannered guy who was also universally liked. And Davies was a member of the Eight. He wasn't really part of the Ashcan School, but he was part of the Eight. And in less than a year's time, Arthur B. Davies, Walt Kuhn, William Fitz Taylor, Walter Pock, and any number of other artists who were part of this group organized an exhibition that comes to be known as the Armory Show. And in less than a year's time, they organized an exhibition with more than 1,000 works of art. So the 1913 International Exhibition of Modern Art in the 69th Street Armory, I think it's 69th Street Armory, it's in the Armory anyway, becomes this critical moment in America's movement towards modern art. And among this is the Cubist Gallery. In the Armory Show, you see works by Brancusi that are immediately recognizable. This is either Bourdelle or Mayol. This is William Lembrook. This was a defining moment in American art history. This was where we get our first taste of Pablo Picasso. This is where we get our first taste of Henri Matisse, and this blue nude was shown at the Armory Show. And this is our first taste of Cubism, this movement that will absolutely astound us. And this is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase from 1912. And this work becomes kind of the emblem of the Armory Show and what it stood for. And here's seeing New York with a Cubist in the evening sun of New York, and you can see it's a parody of the Duchamp painting called Rude Descending a Staircase, Rush Hour at the Subway. Hilarious. But this is just the opening salvo of any number of attacks on modern art. But the thing about the Armory Show, and the critics, every major New York critic I mean, they just couldn't leave it alone. You know, they wrote about Matisse, they wrote about Picasso, they wrote about Duchamp, they wrote about the Cubists, they wrote about the Futurists. There weren't even any Italian Futurists in the show, but they knew the word, and so they put it in their reviews. They hated it. To a person, they hated it, but they couldn't stop writing about it. You know what they didn't write about? They didn't write about Impressionism. And about half the works in the show, in the Armory show, were either French or American Impressionist paintings, including this exquisite thing by J. Alden Weir, Factory Village from 1897, that's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and is in our show as well. It is, you know, it's just a masterpiece. So, but the thing that the Armory show organizers were successful in advancing was that their project was all about independence. The very same thing that had been the great virtue of Impressionism. And you know what else was in the Armory show? This fabulous painting again by Maurice Prendergast. Love it. So by just a couple of years later, there's another World's Fair. There's another World's Fair. It's the Panama Pacific Fair in San Francisco in 1915. It's the fair that sort of shows San Francisco's recovery from the great earthquake and the great fire of about a decade earlier. And if the Colombian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 was the coming out party for Impressionism, the Panama Pacific show was, we've arrived. We own the art world at this moment. And by we, I mean Impressionism. Impressionism dominated the art exhibition at this particular World's Fair. And this painting, The Palace of the Fine Arts, San Francisco from 1916 by Colin Campbell Cooper, now in the collection of the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento, is also in our exhibition. And it's very appropriate that it's there. And Impressionism on the West Coast had already begun to take hold there. And there was a very active group of Impressionist painters on the West Coast. And that's one of the things that this show does very, very well, is showing the geographic range of Impressionism across the country. And so now we're looking at E. Charlton Fortune. E stands for Euphemia. And she was absolutely a fabulous Impressionist painter. This work's also from the Crocker Museum. The thing I like about this is it's a chicken coop at Monterey. Can you imagine such a thing? If she turns around and looks the other way, she's going to be looking at some of the most beautiful scenery in the world. But here, you know, she's painting her chickens, and I kind of like that. This is a great, great painting. It's in the show as well. All right, so by the time Euphemia or E. Charlton Fortune is painting that view of her chickens, the 10 is kind of coming to the end of their run. Their last show will be in 1917, 1918. The year before, William Merritt Chase will pass away in 1916. Remember, John Henry Twachtman had died 15 years earlier. J. Alden Weir will pass away in 1919, just a couple of years later. Willard Metcalf here will die in 1925, and Robert Reed will pass away in 1929. But Childe Hassam, Edmund Tarbell, Thomas Wilmer Dewing, and Edward Simmons will all live into the 1930s and will continue to be Impressionist painters in effect until that time. And so they are pushing the Impressionist aesthetic further and further into the future. And by remaining together, remaining an independent exhibition society, they keep Impressionism very much in the vanguard of fine art in the United States. And one of my favorite paintings in the show is this Edward Redfield. Edward Redfield is part of a group of Pennsylvania Impressionists. He's part of a group that forms, in around New Hope, Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, and it's a colony. And now this is a painting from his vacation in Boothbay Harbor, Maine, but this is a painting from 1928, or maybe sometime between 28 and 1930. And we're still seeing Impressionism do all the things that Impressionism does. Redfield is still a very viable painter at this time. And Impressionism is still something that there is a market for, there's an appetite for, as late as 1930. And then you have Daniel Garber, also part of this group of Pennsylvanians, painting Day in June in 1937. We're just 4 years away from America's involvement in the Second World War, and we are still seeing meaningful works by American Impressionists in exhibitions, in galleries, in the art press. And Garber will live until 1958, which is the year. Garber will live until 1958, which is the year after I was born. So it's amazing. I mean, we think of Impressionism as this 19th century aesthetic, because that's when it was born. And when we think of American Impressionism, we tend to think of the 1890s maybe, but certainly the early part of the 20th century. But we're just, as Americans, we're just not through with it for a really long time. We are still wringing aesthetic value, vanguard value out of this aesthetic right up until the mid 20th century. And so this Garber, hang on, and this E. Charlton Fortune are both in the exhibition. E. Charlton Fortune will live until 1969. So, I mean, Impressionists were in our midst all that time. This Redfield is in the show as well. This work is not, but I include it because it's one of the latest works by an Impressionist that I could find. This is Frank Benson's Chickadees in a Tree from 1946. So now the Second World War is actually over. So, like I said, American artists and Americans in general were still finding value in this aesthetic well after the French had moved on and embraced many, many other isms. So the durability of American Impressionism really depends on this idea of independence, I would say, and it is a useful aesthetic in this country for a very, very long time. So thank you for tuning in to the durability of American Impressionism Part 2. Paul, I'm really sorry if you couldn't hear this. I can't figure why that would be the case, but thank you all for tuning in.
Well, thank you, Kevin. That was great. It was wonderful to learn even more about American Impressionism.
Should I stop share?
You can stop sharing, or maybe a question has to do with a slide. So
okay, that's
keep going.
Good point.
So Paul wanted to let us know that he just finished the catalog for America's Impressionism, and he highly recommends it. And so I was wondering about the painting Hope and Memory that you brought up.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you wish that we still had that painting, and do you know what year it was sold?
I I don't know exactly what year it was sold, but I think it was sold, maybe, Julie might know this, but I think it might have been sold in, sometime between 2000 and 2006, something like that, in the early 21st century. And do I wish we still had it? Yeah, kind of. I think, I think we could have, I think there's some value in that. I mean, one of the things that we don't have, and Julie might jump into this conversation if she's really listening and not just putting up, this image of herself. There she is. What do you think, Julie? Do you wish we still owned that painting?
Yeah. And for the reason you mentioned, that it would be good to have something that kind of tells people what was, like, for the people that weren't embracing Impressionism, what were they, what kind of art were they making? And
Yeah,
I think that painting sold, I think that happened around 2005.
Is that right? So just before we got here.
Mm-hmm.
They should have waited and asked.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it's a, it could, just like when you go to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, there are, I mean, some of the most beautiful Impressionist paintings in the world are there. But so are paintings by academic artists who were very much their foil. And so, I mean, we don't really, Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, or don't, but I can't think of a really academic painting that we own, apart from maybe the Grand Jean.
Yeah, we don't really, and definitely not by an American artist.
Yeah, certainly.
That I can think of. But yeah, the Grand Jean was shown at the Salon in 1882. No, I can't think of any. There's definitely room for growth in our collection.
Yeah. Great question, Lindley. Great question.
Thank you. And Paul was interested in knowing if you know what Impressionists were represented at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904.
Yeah, there were some, and there were, I mean, especially the artists who were in the stable of Paul Duran. He did a really good job of making sure that that his artists were seen in exhibitions, in juried exhibitions and non-juried exhibitions, whether they wanted to be there or not. So yeah, 1904, there were definitely Impressionist painters. Even early, there's a World's Fair. There's a World's Fair of maybe not a World's Fair, a big fair of some kind in Omaha in like maybe 1898 or something like that. I'm just making this up, not about the fair, but the date. It may have been later, in fact. But I know for a fact that Mary Cassatt's La Toilette, where she's the woman in a striped robe giving her child a bath, was in that Omaha show. So, Duran Dewell, Mary Cassatt was a very convenient artist for Paul Duran Dewell, in part because he could present her either as a French artist or as which is kind of where she preferred to be, or as an American painter. And her works would cycle from Boston to New York, to Philadelphia, to Chicago, to Richmond, Indiana, to Washington, D.C., to Dallas, Texas. And they would just be on a kind of circuit and be shown again and again and again. So
the next question is, you mentioned that Prendergast, sorry, my voice is going, Prendergast, his brother made the frame.
Right.
And so was the frame made especially for that painting?
Oh, yeah.
It fits it very well. And here's a good question from Stephen. if you would, please list the 3 to 4 significant criterion to define Impressionism, as I am still not sure how to define this art focus.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a great question, but it was a contested matter. It depends on what kind of Impressionism you're talking about. But I would say this. It's you know, if we're thinking about Claude Monet, you know, we're definitely thinking of painting the landscape and painting it in situ, en plein air, as the French say. So in the open air, from life. You're not going back to your studio and prettying it up. You're painting it right there in front of your subject. You are absolutely concerned, deeply concerned with the effects of light and how light reflects off of objects and influences color. And you know, some people lately have been saying one key hallmark of that kind of Impressionism was the art of recording your subject quickly. You know, I mean, it was the thing that they were criticized for, you know, in their own time, because, you know, this thing looks rushed. This thing looks like a sketch. This thing, but that act of getting the impression is, you know, was critical. Was a critic, and it's the kind of thing that we really admire at this point. You know, that you know, what I call dash, you know, that broad brushwork that covers a lot of canvas in a short amount of time. Now, if you're talking about someone like Edgar Degas, who would never really embrace the name Impressionism, as Mary Cassatt was right about that. But for him, you know, the signature ingredient, and you know, this also kind of applies to the landscapist, is the painting of modern life. The painting of modern life, just ordinary subjects, you know, you and me, you know, walking down the street, looking in a store window, you know, going to the ballet, going to some other popular entertainment, listen to a cafe concert, all of that stuff, going out to eat, you know, all the things we used to do, you know. I don't know how Impressionism would ever get formed right now, but yeah, the painting of modern life. I mean, that's something that had never happened up to that point, really.
Well, the rest of what's in the chat is just accolades for you. And
well, I'm sure you should just read them off. I know everyone wants to hear it. Thank you, everyone.
How about, as before we go, everyone can unmute if you'd like, and just give Kevin a quick thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It was very informative.
Well, thank you. It was fun. It was fun. How did I do on time? Oh, not so good. Sorry about that.
I enjoyed it.
Hey,
I'm
we have
ready to
nothing
come
else
see
to
the
do.
show.
Really,
Yeah,
can't
do.
thank
It's great being with you guys. Thank you.
Great job, Kevin.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely come see the show.
Okay, I'm about to end the meeting. So thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for coming.
Great to be here.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.